All right, hello everyone. We want to thank you for joining us today as we take a look at federal legislation to improve outcomes for 403B plan participants. This event is part of NAGDA's ongoing NAGDA Connect programming. Connect is our virtual engagement series that combines year-round opportunities for engagement and learning for our members. For those of you who participated in our October sessions last year, you may recognize the format. In 2021, we'll offer both small group discussions and panels like this focused on topics relevant to the public sector retirement industry. We're kicking off the year with an excellent panel and a very important topic, and we're excited to get it going. But before we do, I have a couple of housekeeping items. We are recording this presentation, and it will be emailed to all webinar registrants and posted on the website soon after we finished. The slides, and we get this question a lot, so the slides from today can be found on the Connect page under News and Events on NAGDA's website, and they will be emailed to you along with the recording of this session once we're done. So you will get a copy of the slides and the recording. You'll be muted for the duration of the webinar. Please submit questions for the speakers throughout the presentation in the Q&A box in the menu at the bottom of your screen. Your questions will only be visible to me and the speakers, so please feel free to send those anytime, and we'll get to as many of them as possible at the end. We also have the chat feature open, which you may use to chat with your fellow attendees during the presentation. Just a reminder, everyone can see those chats, so be warned. I also want to thank NAGDA's visionary and premier sponsors. NAGDA is a mission-driven nonprofit with the goal of being the collective voice of the public sector DC plan sponsor industry. If you could go to slide 2, we could not meet that mission without the generous support of the companies you see listed here. Thank you to all of you for being terrific examples of long-term partners. All right, so let's get into it. My name is Matt Peterson. I'm NAGDA's Executive Director. I'll be moderating today's panel, and it's a good one, like I said. First, we have with us Sandy Blair. Sandy is the Director of Retirement Readiness for the California State Teachers Retirement System. She also runs the CalSTRS Pension 2 plan and is a current NAGDA Executive Board member and past president. And I could go on and on, but for now, I'll just say welcome, Sandy. Good to see you again. Next, we have Angela Montez. Angela is Senior Vice President, General Counsel, and Chief Legal Officer at ICMARC. Welcome, Angela. And finally, we're delighted to have with us Erin Shapiro. Erin is the Head of Policy Research at Morningstar, Inc. Welcome, Erin. All right, as you can see, we have a wonderful group of experts lined up to dive into this topic today. But before we do, we have one more important voice that we would like to add to the mix. He couldn't be here today with us in person, but joining us via recording to say a few words is the Honorable Jimmy Panetta. Congressman Panetta is a Democrat from California's 20th District, and he introduced standalone legislation last year to include CITs as an investment option for 403B plans. So let's take a moment to hear from Congressman Panetta on this important topic. Tracy, are we getting the sound through?
Hello, everyone. I'm Jimmy Panetta, the United States Representative for the Central Coast of California in California's 20th Congressional District. I want to thank you for this opportunity to address virtually the National Association of Government-Defined Contribution Administrators. I say that because the work you do is critical for ensuring the financial security of so many public servants. You know that as we shift away from traditional pensions towards tax-advantaged and defined contribution plans, we really need to ensure that these plans are providing our state, territory, and local government workers healthy returns and a very secure retirement. Now, I'm proud to say that Congress is also focused on that goal and is really doing it in a bipartisan way. See, when it comes to improving the retirement options for Americans, we in Congress have actually been able to work together on this. In the 116th Congress, the Ways and Means Committee, which I'm a member of, passed the SECURE Act, or the Setting Every Community Up for Retirement Enhancement Act, which really was landmark bipartisan legislation that expanded opportunities for retirement saving. The House passed it, the Senate passed it, and yes, the president signed it into law. Now, the good thing about the Secure Act is that it contained provisions that are really beneficial to government employees with defined contribution plans. But the bill also increased the age that required minimum distribution start. It permitted distributions for childbirth and adoption expenses, and it provided flexibility to roll over lifetime income products to new plans. Now, in the 117th Congress, I'm looking forward to working together to support those types of plans once again. See, at the end of last Congress, Ways and Means Chairman Richard Neal and Ranking Member Brady introduced the Securing a Strong Retirement Act, or as many of you might know it as Secure 2.0. Now, I'm proud that the bill contains bipartisan legislation that I have pushed for called the Public Service Retirement Fairness Act. Now, that doesn't have a cute acronym, but let me tell you, it does allow 403B plans to utilize collective investment trust, or CITs. Such a provision will provide public school and college employees and other 403B plan participants, such as those in nonprofits, with access to the same lower cost investment vehicles available to other state and local government employees. Now, those types of employees should not be disadvantaged relative to other government and public service employers simply because they are offered a 403B plan. These types of collective investment trusts, or CITs, saved costs by reducing fees, which really can mean thousands of dollars for individual plan participants. Those are real benefits for teachers, professors, administrators, and others working in schools and colleges, as well as those who are doing critical charity and community work at nonprofit organizations. So thank you at NAGDCA for supporting this legislation and helping ensure that it remains a bipartisan priority. Now, having grown up in the family I did, and yes, as a member of the Problem Solvers Caucus in Congress, I understand, but I also value the strength of bipartisanship. Now, with slim Democratic majorities in the House and the Senate, I believe it's very, very important that we continue to work across the aisle in order to have long-lasting legislation. Now, I know it feels like there is a lot of conflict right now between and even within our parties. From a national election to numerous lies and legal challenges about the election's results to an insurrection to stop the certification of the election. It's true, nerves are a little frayed, and I can tell you, relationships in Congress are being tested. However, as President Biden stated so eloquently in his inaugural speech that he gave just a couple days ago, but also why I believe 81 million people voted for him, it is time to heal. It is time we work together. And I do believe that if we can do that, nothing can stop us. I'm confident that the new administration will work hard in the spirit of bipartisanship. But I also believe that we can start by working together to make it easier for Americans to save and have greater retirement security for a lifetime of work. I'm very hopeful that the kind of bipartisanship partnership forged by the Secure Act and encouraged by President Biden can help us move forward, not only in the next phase of retirement legislation, but also with continued bipartisan bills in the Ways and Means Committee, in Congress, and yes, for our country. Thank you.
I mentioned before that NAGDCA could not meet its mission without the generous support of its sponsors. That sentiment goes double for our many strong allies on Capitol Hill. Leaders like Congressman Panetta, most of you know Senators Portman and Cardin are working every day to help us improve the retirement readiness of public sector workers. So Sandy, Congressman Panetta has a little more meaning to you. He's from California, and you worked closely with his office when you were NAGDCA president as they considered this legislation. Can you tell us a little bit about the conversations you had in that process?
Sure. First, I want to extend my thanks to Congressman Panetta for championing this legislation. And I was very happy when his office reached out to me at CalSTRS as part of their research for this effort. We had a couple of scheduled discussions that were very productive. And as he stated in his video, he began moving this legislation forward. But let me step back a bit to discuss some of the ways that NAGDCA solicits ideas for new legislative proposals, and that is from our membership. Each year we go out to our membership and request ideas, and this particular legislation was proposed. To propose these CITs did come from one of our members asking the committee to take a look at possibility of adding CITs to 403B plans. And from there, the NAGDCA Legislative Committee and the board review these proposals. And this one was one that we added to our legislative priorities. In addition, each year, the NAGDCA board engages Congress with our Capitol Hill visits, which we did this in person. And a number of years back, the question was asked in one of those visits is, why are we still not allowing CITs in 403B plans? And with the offices that we asked that, they didn't really know that that wasn't available in 403Bs. And so really embracing this legislation as a bipartisan effort, and I really credit those in Congress who immediately got on board. We had a great meeting last year in Congressman Panetta's office and talking about this legislation and the efforts that they had done and NAGDCA's support of this legislation. And in addition, I also want to credit the industry who have lended great support to this legislation, forming a coalition to support this effort.
All right, thank you, Sandy. I also want to acknowledge your leadership in this, not just with Congressman Panetta's office, but in helping to guide NAGDCA as our organization considered this issue. So thank you for that.
Thanks,
Angela, Sandy mentioned that there are a lot of organizations that are interested in this. It's important to remember, for us, that NAGDCA is just one voice in the room. You've been involved with us in a broader coalition advocating for the inclusion of CITs and 403B plans. Can you help us take a step back and maybe talk a little bit about what CITs are, how the idea of adding them as an option for 403B plans has evolved over time on the legislative front, and who's involved in those talks?
Sure. Thank you, Matt. Thank you for having me here today. It's been our delight to partner with NAGDCA on these issues. Sandy talked about efforts to make CITs available in 403B plans, but as a basic question, sort of what are CITs? They're pooled investment vehicles that are organized as trusts and maintained by a bank or trust company for the commingled investment of assets of different investors. There are two categories of CITs, but for purposes of our discussion today, we'll focus on CITs that pool retirement plan assets. They're often referred to as 3C11 trusts after the exemption from registration for these vehicles under the Investment Company Act of 1940. And you might also have heard them called 81-100 trusts after the revenue ruling that gave tax preferred status to these pools of retirement plan assets. They're generally only available to qualified plans such as ERISA 401k plans and governmental 401a plans, but are also available to governmental 457 plans. But as the result of an historical anomaly, they're generally not available to most 403B plans. This is largely because when 403B plans were developed back in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the only investment options that were permitted were annuities. And then over time, mutual funds were added at around the time that ERISA was enacted. So it's really been historically a need to expand the universe of investment options available within the statute, not some sort of philosophical objection to having CITs and 403B plans. Next slide, please. So CITs seem like the new kids on the block. And while they're just gaining traction in 401k plans, they've actually been around for decades, dating back to the late 20s and 30s, particularly in defined benefit plans. We've actually made CITs available in our 401 and 457 plans since the 1980s, but there are a number of reasons why they didn't gain traction broadly back in the early days. Next slide, please. For starters, purchases and withdrawals were processed manually back in those days, and CITs were typically valued only once per quarter. They were also seen as opaque, as the lack of a regulatory disclosure regime meant that investors had little access to portfolio data and performance and expense information. So when DB plans started to disappear in the private sector in the 1980s, and 401k plans became the primary employer-sponsored plans in the private sector, mutual funds became the investment vehicles of choice, given their daily valuation, portfolio transparency, and the fact that investors could look up their performance in the newspaper. The tide really started to turn for CITs in the early 2000s when they were added to the NSCC's mutual fund trading platform FundServe. This provided for automated transaction processing and a daily valuation environment, so CITs essentially traded the same as mutual funds at that point. But CITs really got a boost back in 2006 when the Pension Protection Act blessed their use as a qualified default investment alternatives, or QDIAs. And this is where the vast majority of participant account flows go these days. The DOL's fee disclosure regulations in 2012 standardized fee, performance, and expense disclosures, allowing plan sponsors and participants to make apples-to-apples comparisons among different investment options, including CITs. And notably, Morningstar began to track and rate CITs, providing a trusted and widely available data source for investors to be able to evaluate them. And finally, litigation also played a role in the rise in CITs, as plan sponsors looked to lower cost options as one way of avoiding fiduciary liability. This issue was really crystallized in the Supreme Court's decision in Tibble versus Edison, where the court essentially held that a plan sponsor's failure to remove higher cost retail share class options from its plan essentially constituted a violation of the duty to monitor, which could support a fiduciary breach claim. Next slide, please. So with all that in mind, now that the operational barriers to adoption of CITs have largely been addressed for 401k and 457 plans, it made sense to try and eliminate the statutory barrier for 403b plans. The stage was first set for CIT and 403b legislation when longtime retirement policy advocates and allies, Rob Portman and Ben Cardin, included the provision in their Retirement Security and Savings Act in the last week of the legislative session in 2018. These two senators have really been in the forefront of sweeping retirement reforms for the past two decades, dating back to EGTRA, the Small Business Job Protection Act, and PPA when they were both in the House. And their partnership has really taken on a new urgency now that Senator Portman has announced his plan to retire in 2022. The Portman-Cardin provision, as originally introduced, would amend the Internal Revenue Code and federal securities laws to allow 403b plans to invest in CITs. The provision generally would condition this either on the plan being subject to ERISA or the plan sponsor accepting fiduciary responsibility for selecting the plan investment lineup. But as I mentioned, this bill was introduced very late in 2018, and it essentially served as a marker for the direction that Portman and Cardin would pursue in future packages. Next slide, please. So Portman and Cardin reintroduced their bill in May of 2019 in substantially the same form with a few refinements, one of which was to make clear that the bill would allow governmental 403b plans to invest in CITs on the same basis as their governmental 401 and 457 plan counterparts. This provision appeared to have real momentum and very little controversy, but it was stuck in line behind the Secure Act, which had stalled in the Senate after being passed in the House that May. As you might recall, the Secure Act was derailed for almost 6 months when 4 Republican senators placed legislative holds on the bill that were largely unrelated to the retirement reforms in the bill. That summer, Senator Portman signaled his willingness to potentially break off pieces of his bill to try and get them included in the Secure Act. And we thought that the CIT and 403b provision seemed to be a really good candidate because it had strong bipartisan support. It had been socialized for several months, and it's revenue neutral, so it wouldn't add to the cost of the overall bill. But the provision hadn't been vetted on the House side at that time, and it lacked a House companion bill. And ultimately, the Secure Act was passed as an end-of-the-year scramble in 2019 as part of a larger spending package to avoid a government shutdown. So there was a real hesitancy to try and include other provisions that might further derail passage. But the midterm elections the prior year also ushered in another long-standing retirement advocate in Congressman Richard Neal, who's now at the helm of the Ways and Means Committee, and that renewed the focus on retirement issues on the House side. And this led to the introduction of the Public Service Retirement Fairness Act last March by Congressman Panetta, who you heard from at the beginning of the webinar. And this bill has broad bipartisan support in the committees of jurisdiction, and it provided the House companion that was needed to the Portman and Cardin bill that had been working its way through the Senate side since 2018. Next slide, please. So this ultimately paved the way for the CIT and 403B provision to be included in the package that's commonly referred to as Secure 2.0 last October. While Chairman Neal had initially indicated his interest in trying to move this bill through committee in the first half of 2021, the 2020 elections gave the Democrats an unexpected majority in both chambers of Congress. And this has led to sort of a near-term emphasis or focus on other Democratic priorities in the retirement space. And also, COVID relief has taken center stage and remains a focus that dominates the legislative focus this year, as it should. And so we expect that this will have some impact on slippage of this provision. But Senator Portman, he continues to seek to move his legislation forward on a bipartisan basis, and his Finance Subcommittee held hearings on retirement issues in December. We understand he's planning to reintroduce his bill potentially as early as this month, and also that Congressman Panetta plans to reintroduce his bill this month. Last slide, please, or next slide, please. So how did we get to this point? It's largely been through the efforts of NAGDCA and other like-minded organizations and companies that have formed a coalition to support CIT and 403B legislation. NAGDCA was among the first organizations to raise awareness on the Hill of the need for this legislation. And in the spring of 2018, a single-issue coalition of plan sponsors, providers, and industry organizations was also formed to try and advance this legislation, which ultimately resulted in the Portman-Cardin bill being introduced that fall. The coalition has morphed and reconstituted since then and includes many of the key providers and organizations in the retirement space, as well as plan sponsors and support from some unions. Importantly, there is broad representation among the provider community on the coalition. There are fund companies, insurance companies, plan administrators, and record keepers, among others. And this has resulted in little vocal opposition to the provision, as most providers are vehicle agnostic, since they have the ability to make CITs available just as they do with other investment vehicles. Both individually and as a group, we've met multiple times with key policy staff of the committees of jurisdiction and other members of Congress to shine maximum light on this legislation. I think this is really a great example of how the industry can come together to get behind changes that benefit our teachers, hospital workers, and nonprofit employees.
All right. Well, thank you, Angela. And your firm, ICMARC, has been a leading voice on this issue and a really great partner in the coalition. To see this reach the finish line, hopefully. I know it's a windy road, as your slides showed. Anything legislative usually is, but we really appreciate the partnership. And Aaron, I want to turn to you for a bit. Angela told us about CITs, the history, their legislative history, but an important question for our members, for plan sponsors, is why should I want these? And Morningstar's done some really good quantitative research to show the value of CITs. Can you share some of what you've learned and why there may be interest in the 403B plan sponsor community in adding this?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks so much for inviting me to speak. A good question here is, okay, we've heard a lot about CITs, their evolution, some allusions to them being cheaper. How precisely do they benefit retirement plans? And so I'm going to walk through a variety of ways we've looked at this question. Let me start with the sort of most basic kind of analysis. If you compare the cost of the CIT tiers to mutual funds, CITs are almost always cheaper. So that's true 91% of the time overall. And then if we compare CITs just to the least expensive mutual fund share class, you get 82%. Okay, so it's a real basic, simple analysis. I actually think the story is probably even better than this. Because there are CIT share classes that we don't really know what the fee is because they are individually negotiated. Okay, so that's sort of the simple basic story. Let's dive in a little bit more on the next slide. One thing that you might think is, well, CITs, a lot of the rollouts have been with passive vehicles. Are we comparing apples to apples here? And the answer is that CITs are cheaper. They're about 60% of the price when you look at active strategies, and they're about 60% of the price when you look at passive strategies. So in either case, CITs are really delivering more returns at the end of the day for investors because investors get what they don't pay for in this case. Next slide, please. Okay, so I think you have some sense of how CITs can do this, but is there a catch here? CITs are not marketed or regulated like mutual funds. That saves some cost. But as Angela discussed, they do have to have comprehensive disclosures, at least in the ERISA space, and also just because sponsors and participants demand them. So I think that 2012 regulation is quite helpful in terms of standardizing. But even before that, sponsors were looking for these kinds of disclosures. Participants were looking for these kind of disclosures. In practice, you don't seem to be losing much there. There is an issue where some mutual funds will have revenue sharing built in, which is not typical at all with CITs. Those might include sub-transfer agency fees, other kinds of costs that go to the record keeper that pay for services. So somebody does have to pay for those services, somewhere along the line. So an important question is the reduction we're seeing in CITs because they, fully unbundle the management cost from other kinds of cost, is that part of what we're seeing here? And I'll get into that in the next slide, but you can see from these big differences in fees that can't possibly account for all of it. So, this really is one of these cases where we have just a more efficient way of designing a pooled investment vehicle, and then that benefit can be enjoyed by retirement plan participants. Next slide, please. It's important to understand that CITs are really coming to dominate retirement plans. What you can see here is just among target dates, and I'm sort of using that as a proxy for qualified default investment alternatives because we don't exactly know what is and is not in QDIA from the data we have. That CITs are an increasingly large share, and I say increasingly. If we look at the next slide here. Because over the last 6 years, almost all the new launches have been CIT launches, and so I actually think it's really critical that these are available to public sector workers as well as private sector workers, because if not, they're not going to have access to sort of the latest and greatest. They're just increasingly strategies that are solely being launched through CITs, and we're not seeing a lot of that with traditional 40 Act mutual funds at this point. Next slide, please. So, I alluded to this earlier. It is the case that CITs don't have a bundled cost structure where they're sharing some of the management fee or, back with record keepers. And so we wanted to really, tighten up this answer and look specifically at retirement plans that use CITs, and then look all in, do they cost less? And the answer is they absolutely do. So, not surprisingly, the plans with CITs have slightly higher administrative costs. Exactly what I would expect, because those are going to be explicitly charged to somebody, to the employer, directly to the participant, whatever it is. But when we look at the entire picture using our database that marries the Form 5500 public disclosures with our own data, we still find that just for retirement plans that have at least one CIT, their all-in cost for a typical participant is 10 basis points lower than plans that don't have at least one CIT. And this gets better and better as you've got plans that have more CITs. We don't find that this is true for the really small end of the market. I think it will be in the future, but we didn't find this to be true for plans with fewer than 25 million in assets. And I actually think a lot of that is that those plans, if they have a CIT, it tends to just be one stable value fund. So I don't think that that's all that surprising either. But really, the overwhelming story here is that CITs cost less. Retirement plan sponsors that use them are able to deliver an investment lineup that will cost their participants less, even when we include administrative costs. And it's really just an overall win. And again, these are almost always strategies that would otherwise simply be available. This is changing, but would have traditionally just been available as in a 40 Act mutual fund structure. So we're not seeing different kinds of strategies. We're seeing these just increasingly come to make up they're soon going to be the majority of the target date market. And so I really don't think there's anything really negative to say here. Next slide. The sort of one point I would make here is the CITs and ERISA plans are regulated by DOL. The trustees are ERISA fiduciaries. They usually file their own disclosure. Sometimes it's done through the plan sponsor itself, through the 5500. But either way, there's sort of a federal nexus there. And as Angela alluded to or discussed, that also means that they're disclosing their fee structures in a standardized way. So as these move into the 403B space, we really like that the legislation requires the plan sponsor to say, yes, I am a fiduciary, unless they're a 403B that's already in the ERISA space, in which case they already are a fiduciary. But it might be something that plan sponsors want to consider as they think about adding CITs, is just looking and seeing, okay, is the CIT already offered in an ERISA plan? If so, am I getting the same kinds of disclosures? Presumably, yes. If not, do the disclosures look similar to other CITs? Do I, understand what's going on here? Yeah, I don't think there's likely to be a huge problem there. And these have been used in other kinds of public sector plans for some time now. But it's just something that sponsors may want to consider as they're looking at CIT offerings. But overall, I think CITs have been a really important contributor to the reduction in costs that plan participants have enjoyed over the last couple of decades.
Thanks a lot, Aaron. I appreciate that. And I think that last point's a really interesting one, and maybe we can stick on that for a second. Angela, ICMARC only operates in the government market, and you've seen how CITs have worked in a non-ERISA space for a while. Any concerns from what you've seen, what Aaron's bringing up?
Actually, we've been very successful in our ability to make CITs available on the same sort of transparent basis that Aaron mentioned. It takes place in the ERISA space. I think that ERISA fee disclosure, notwithstanding that governmental plans are not subject to ERISA, providers who are operating in that space tend to follow those regulations by analogy, just because all the other providers are operating in sort of both spaces. So we found that transparency is not an issue. We found that they operate very well in the governmental space. So I think that this just would expand more into the governmental space and while I think it's probably good to look to ERISA by analogy, look to ERISA disclosures to the extent you're not getting them from your provider. I think that by and large most providers are doing the same types of things on the governmental side that they're doing in the ERISA space. So we haven't found it to be a problem.
Great. And that's a great point. Sandy, as an administrator, how are you thinking about the potential advantages of adding CITs to your lineup, or what thought process do you go through? You're on mute.
So we all know the impact that fees have on retirement accounts. And as Angela and Aaron have explained, the CITs offer the ability to have lower fees for our participants. So it's, with this legislation, again, it's important to come to the finish line on this so that we as plan administrators have the ability to, as fiduciaries, which we are at CalSTRS, to offer lower fees to our participants in our plans. And having said that, it doesn't mean that, you have to offer CITs, so that's going to be at the discretion of the plan, the research that they would do, where they might have opportunities to fill some gaps in their plan lineups, to, break down and have some different offerings that could be cheaper than what we already have. And, I think we need to be consistent with 401ks and 457s. We need to treat our teachers and healthcare workers and other nonprofit employees at least as well as all the other individuals saving in those 401ks and 457s so that they too can have as successful of retirement outcomes. So I think, each plan is going to have to look internally. They're going to have to, weigh the pros and cons. They're going to have to, evaluate on their individual basis. Do they feel they want to bring those in? Is there a demand for that? Is it going to be something that complements what they already have in their lineups? And will that fill any gaps for them? And I think, we will all embrace that as this legislation hopefully comes to the finish line and gets passed. We will be looking at that and ways to save our participants money.
That's a great point, Sandy. So, an expansion of choices really, and not a mandate, of course, but a good option to have. So we really appreciate that, and a terrific discussion. We've talked about the past and the path, the kind of windy path these provisions have taken, all the interested parties involved. So let's take a minute to look in the future. I think, we all enjoy kind of thinking ahead and considering what might be, especially with something like this that we've seen come up a few times. It's February. The November election may finally be done. Everything seems to have shaken out as it's going to. Aaron, let's start with you. what are you seeing? You know, we had a lot of entire retirement bills, as Angela mentioned, that have been introduced. Given the dynamics in Washington now, what do you think the prospects are for both retirement legislation in general to be passed this year, and then specifically the 403B CIT provision?
So I do think that this 403B CIT provision will eventually become law. You know, in terms of this year, look, it's hard to go broke betting consistently against Congress doing something with 50-50 odds. It is what it is. You know, Secure 1.0 took between 6 and 10 years, depending on how you want to count, you know, from those provisions being introduced. I actually think the election in Georgia makes these kind of provisions somewhat less likely to pass. This can't be done through reconciliation because it doesn't have any, at least it doesn't have any, it will not get scored as having any budgetary impact. I could argue that it does, because, you know, there's, you know, some deferred tax revenue in there, but in any case, it can't be done through reconciliation. And, you know, I think you're going to see some big retirement things, particularly with the multi-employer plans. That's all already kind of moving through the reconciliation process. That may make it a little bit more difficult to pick this up. The only other stuff that's going to move, I think, between reconciliation bills, which, you know, your maximum of 3, because you only have 1 per fiscal year, and I think you can squeeze 3 into this calendar year, are going to be appropriate bills. Maybe it could get put on that, but, you know, I'd love to see this pass. But I think it's, you know, it could happen, but I guess I think it's going to be tough. You know, compound that with the fact that there was more bipartisan comity when Secure 1.0 was working through Ways and Means, and I think there will be now. And that, I think, makes it tough too. You know, you might need to do this through, I mean, the other way would try to do it through unanimous consent. I think it's just gonna be tough to do. But, you know, I'm optimistic because everybody thinks it's a good idea, but that doesn't necessarily mean it will happen quickly.
That sounds somewhat optimistic. I think we'll take that. So, Angela, what do you think? Any differences, or are you seeing things kind of the same?
Well, you know, I'm going to continue to hold out optimism, but I do agree with Aaron that, you know, bipartisanship has been impacted, you know, since Secure was passed last year. That said, I think that, you know, retirement is the one space where we really do see bipartisanship on issues. And if anybody's going to be, who's not going to be impacted by these hits on bipartisanship, it's Chairman Neal. I think that he's really committed to advancing retirement legislation. Portman and Cardin have been, and certainly, you know, I think Portman's announced retirement sort of lens, as I mentioned, you know, an urgency to get some of the things that he's had as priorities through Congress before he leaves in 2022. So my hope is that they can continue to act on a bipartisan basis on retirement legislation, and notwithstanding the fact that, you know, this provision can't get picked up in reconciliation. I mean, it really only has probably, you know, another chance in the fall. I think that it's one of the most, it's really the provision that I think folks on the Hill hear most about in the retirement space, or at least in the Secure 2.0 package. So I think that if anything has a good chance of passing this year, if anything has a chance of getting picked up in an appropriations bill or you know, in the fall, then I think that this is among them. Probably
so you could
among
see
the
you could
first.
see it getting
Yeah.
tacked on to an appropriations bill or something like that, because it does have some interest.
If anything is going to, yeah, if anything we're going to, I think this might be a good candidate. Again, you know, as Aaron mentioned, it doesn't have a revenue score; it's revenue neutral. So if you're looking to tack it onto something, it's not going to cost you more. More than likely, though, if any, you know, Secure 2.0 is going to move as a unified package. I think that, you know, folks who've been behind it in the industry are looking to move it along on that basis. But I do think that, you know, there remain sort of vocal advocates among the leadership of the, you know, the committees of jurisdiction. So it's hopeful that whether it gets picked up, you know, on a standalone basis and in a purpose bill, or becomes, you know, part of the actual full package moves, it's really a matter of when, not if.
Agree?
So you cut out for a second there.
Oh, sorry about that. I said, did you have anything to add? Kind of final thoughts?
That was directed at me?
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. No, I mean, I agree with that. I think there's just sort of a difference in emphasis. And it's, you know, it's hard to game that out. But I think that's exactly right. And I would agree. I mean, if of all of the, I mean, retirement has traditionally been a pretty bipartisan space, and we continue to see that. And so, you know, I think if you want to be optimistic, we're at least in the right, we're in the right sector for that.
Right industry. There you go. We'll take that. We'll take that. Well, we don't have any questions so far, so I am going to leave it open for a minute, and I'm going to kind of tell you what we have coming up next. If anybody has anything you want to send in, you can do that now. So I will just say that I want to thank all of you for coming on the panel. I think it was an excellent layout of everything that we've looked at as NAGDCA when it comes to CITs, and the reason that we stood behind some of this legislation and really have supported it through the process. We did get one question in terms of disclosure or education requirement needs for participants. What should you consider for CITs? Aaron, do you have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I mean, our what we see is that I would wager that most participants who are invested in a CIT, particularly when it's a QDIA, but otherwise as well, probably have no idea like what a 40 Act mutual fund is, that they're in a CIT, and I think that's the way it should be. I mean, from a participant's perspective, these look and feel like mutual funds. They have daily liquidity. They just they operate exactly the same way. They've got a sponsor looking out for them and ensuring they're selecting a CIT that is doing what it says it does. So I think as long as participants are getting the kinds of disclosures that they would expect to see, that will help them understand the strategy and understand the fees. I don't think it really should be any different from a participant's perspective. Yeah.
Angela, anything you want to add on that?
I would just add that, plan sponsors, as they're looking to, include these types of options in their plans, just, ask in RFPs or in other solicitations, whether or not the provider is going to follow the same, ERISA disclosure, the same disclosures that would be required for ERISA plans, for these plans. I think that, that will help to make sure that you're getting consistent disclosure across the board if you're in a governmental plan. And I think that the disclosures that DOL has set forth, really are helpful in, breaking it down for participants in a way that's understandable.
And I'll just say, part of our, scope as we're investigating and looking at these options, I'm going to speak positively once this legislation is passed and we have the opportunity to work with our partners, that will be part of our vetting process as plans and looking at, is this something that we want to do? Or do we want to add? And what kind, what ones, where do we need to fill those gaps in our lineups? And it gives us the opportunity to explore all of that and have better participant outcomes in the end. And that's really what we're all here for, is we want people saving towards that successful retirement. That's in everybody's best interest that we're able to help facilitate that process along with our membership and across the country. So I'm hopefully optimistic, and I'm being involved in this from the beginning. I'm very excited about the opportunities that this will allow. And I just thank everybody for all of their support in moving these efforts forward. So it's been a great thing to see, from Congress to our industry partners, really supporting NAGDCA in these efforts as well. So I just want to say thank you for that.
We did get one other question. I think this is a good one. I've heard this one a few times. The question is, does the reduction in the price of mutual funds make it less important to get CITs into these plans? And, we've talked a lot about parity. Aaron, you guys have done a lot of quantitative research. They should, like you said, they should look a lot alike, right? Do mutual funds kind of squeeze in at some point where, on the price side, where adding CITs becomes less of an important issue?
I don't think so. I have that slide where I show the difference in the average fees for mutual funds and CITs, and the CITs are like 60% the price for active, and about 60% the price for passive. And some of those fees for mutual funds, that fee compression is pretty much all the way there, and there are just a lot more costs associated with running a mutual fund than offering the exact same strategy in a CIT wrapper. The other reason I would say I think that this expansion of availability in 403Bs is still quite urgent, although it is certainly true that there has really never been a better time to be an investor in any vehicle. Fees have come down across the board over the last 10 years. Is that slide that I showed on all of the new CIT launches in the target date fund space compared to mutual fund launches, most of the asset managers that are competing in the defined contribution space are primarily focused on their CIT vehicles. And this is a business that is based on scale, and as more and more assets flow out of mutual funds in the ERISA space and into the CITs, I think that gap is actually going to get wider. It's going to be even easier to reduce fees for CITs, much harder to do so for mutual funds. Maybe less attractive to say, okay, we're going to create a new share class that's an institutional share class where before we didn't have one, or to really try to focus on reducing the overall fee on an AUM basis as we scale up, because they're not scaling up in assets. So I actually, I don't think that gap is going to disappear, and it might further widen as CITs just sort of gain increasing traction in the DC space. So I wouldn't say there's less urgency.
Angela, you want to add anything?
Yeah, the thing I would add is, in addition to the fee impact, which I completely agree with Aaron on, CITs also give greater flexibility for plan sponsors to sort of customize solutions for their participants, particularly in the target date space. For example, you can have a glide path that's sort of customized more towards the retirement patterns of governmental participants that may help provide a better option for participants within that plan. So I think in addition to sort of the better cost, the lower fees that you get in CITs, you get greater flexibility and more ability to customize for a plan's participant base.
Great. So we did have one final question. I think it's more of a clarification when we talk about the idea. There has been very broad support for retirement legislation to move. Just kind of a re-clarification on what would be the reason that would be less likely now, given that that the House and the Senate and the White House are all aligned, at least on a party basis. You want to kind of further elucidate that? Maybe start with Aaron.
Yeah, sure. I may have glossed over this a little bit. So let me try to break it down a little bit more. So this legislation has to be passed on a bipartisan basis. The thing is that Democrats can do their sort of top retirement priorities on a unilateral basis without bipartisan support, because they can do it through this arcane vehicle called reconciliation on a straight party line vote. And you're going to see that with sort of a multi-employer. I don't mean to use the word pejoratively, but bailout. I mean, those pension plans need money. That's the solution to them not having money to pay their participants. And so I think that could just sort of take the wind out of the sails. I would also just say, I mean, doing things on a bipartisan basis like this, these are like good governance things. They're important. There's sort of wide support, but there's no crisis, or at least no crisis that is sort of forces Congress to act. And so it's very hard to use unanimous consent in the Senate. There's surely going to be some part of this package that somebody objects to, and so it needs to be tacked on to some other legislation. That's why you only have a couple of shots at doing this. So it's both sort of a procedural issue, and I just think if you had divided government, you probably wouldn't be able to get these democratic priorities on retirement security through, and they would sort of say, well, what we do want to do something on retirement, we can focus on these bipartisan things. So that's the theory. I'm still, again, I would encourage you to be optimistic, but also manage expectations of what Congress is capable of achieving in any given year.
We'll stay optimistic. Well, I think that's a good way forward. And Angela, anything you want to add?
No, I think that's exactly right. I think that if the Democrats hadn't gained the majority, then there would be more emphasis on the need to work on a bipartisan basis to move legislation. But since they have the majority, they have the ability to move these really high priority things that have been around for a number of years through the reconciliation process. I would just add that the Secure 2.0, I think it has broad bipartisan support, but probably still looking for amounts to pay for some of the provisions. CIT and 403B is not one of them, so that also makes it a little bit more difficult to move on a bipartisan basis. Yeah,
that's a great point. Great point. Okay. Well, I think you've answered everybody's questions and anything that it could have come up. So fantastic job again. Thank you all for coming today. And thank you to all of you for attending today's webinar. As a reminder for our plan sponsors, NAGDCA Connect is continuing next week with some small group discussions. So we'll just be breaking you out into small groups with your peers. Those sessions are split up by geography. So you are going to be matched up with other people from your part of the country, and it should be a lot of fun. So if you haven't had a chance to sign up for that, be sure to do so as soon as you can. It'll be next week. I also want to mention that we have a PRRL webinar. That's our eBRI data partnership coming up on March 17th. We're going to take a deep dive into public sector DC investments. So it should be a lot of interesting findings on that one. Be on the lookout for much more about that in the coming weeks. With that, we're going to wrap it up a little bit early. We thank you again for attending and being here, and have a great rest of your day.